The plane hummed with the sound of engines as it prepared for takeoff. In first class, the atmosphere was one of luxury and privilege, where comfort and exclusivity were the unspoken rules. Passengers sat back in their plush seats, sipping champagne and chatting softly, their surroundings a far cry from the cramped quarters of economy class. But for one passenger, Maya Henderson, the journey would soon take a very different turn. Maya, a young black woman, dressed simply in a pair of well-worn jeans, sneakers, and a plain white t-shirt, sat calmly in her seat, gazing out of the window. She wasn't the typical first-class passenger, not in appearance, not in attire, and certainly not in the expectations others had of her. Her presence alone seemed to unsettle the flight attendant, Brenda Collins, whose eyes darted over the cabin with a judgmental gaze. Brenda, a flight attendant for nearly 20 years, had seen it all. She prided herself on being able to spot trouble a mile away. She walked down the aisle, her steps purposeful, her eyes locked on Maya, who sat near the front of the plane. There was something about the way Maya looked, her unpolished, simple appearance, that caused Brenda to immediately question her presence in such a luxurious space. Maya, unaware of Brenda's growing suspicion, continued to look out the window, her thoughts lost in the clouds. It wasn't until Brenda arrived at her seat that she was abruptly pulled back to reality. "Excuse me," Brenda said, her tone sharp and condescending. "You're in the wrong seat. This is first class. I need you to leave." Maya looked up, confused. "I'm sorry," she asked, her voice calm and composed. "This is first class," Brenda repeated, her voice rising slightly. "You don't belong here." Without giving Maya a chance to respond, Brenda snatched Maya's boarding pass from her hands, ripping it in half with a swift motion. The tear of paper echoed through the cabin, causing several passengers to glance over. Brenda threw the torn boarding pass at Maya's feet, the fragments scattering across the floor like discarded trash. "Pick it up," Brenda snapped, "and get out of here. You're not welcome in first class." The words were like a slap in the face, far more painful than the one Brenda would deliver moments later. Maya stood there in shock, her face reddening with the sting of humiliation, but she did not move. The slap that followed was sudden, swift, and cruel. Brenda's hand collided with Maya's cheek, the force sending her head snapping to the side. The sound of the slap seemed to echo through the entire cabin. It was a moment frozen in time. Brenda stood over her, sneering with satisfaction as she watched the effect of her actions. "That's what you get for trying to scam your way into first class," Brenda muttered under her breath. She stepped back, arms crossed, as the passengers around them sat in stunned silence. Maya remained motionless for a moment, her cheek burning from the impact, but she did not crumble. The cabin was eerily quiet, and for a brief second, the reality of the situation seemed to shift. The flight attendant stood waiting for some sort of reaction, but Maya did not show fear, anger, or even surprise. She was just still. The murmurs of nearby passengers started to rise. Some were recording the moment on their phones, while others exchanged looks of approval. "About time someone dealt with these scammers," a man muttered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. A woman seated nearby nodded in agreement. "People like that don't belong here," she whispered. It was clear that Maya, simply by the way she looked, had been judged and found wanting. The disdain in Brenda's eyes was palpable, her actions fueled by assumptions that Maya had somehow stolen her way into this exclusive space. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this woman, the one they saw as an outsider, an interloper, was someone far more significant than they could have ever guessed. As the flight attendants continued to glare at her, Maya slowly bent down, picking up the shredded pieces of her boarding pass without a word. The sting on her cheek was still fresh, but she didn't flinch as she collected the paper fragments. She held herself with dignity, standing tall in the face of blatant cruelty. Despite the humiliation, there was a calmness in her demeanor that unnerved Brenda. Maya's silence spoke volumes. It was clear that she was not a person who would be cowed by insults or violence, no matter how deeply they stung. But Brenda, who had spent years dealing with the occasional unruly passenger, assumed she had won this battle. "Did you hear me?" Brenda shouted, her voice growing more shrill with frustration. "I told you to pick up the pieces and get back to your place. You're making this worse for yourself." She pointed aggressively toward the door, but Maya simply stood there, unshaken. Brenda's words were meant to break Maya's spirit, to force her into submission. But Maya remained unmoved. The slap still stung on her cheek, but there was no tear in her eyes, no tremble in her hands. She stood firm, a quiet strength emanating from her. Her silence spoke of resilience, of something deeper than the moment's cruelty. As the passengers watched, some with glares of contempt and others with looks of silent judgment, Maya's stillness began to turn the tide. Her composure, her refusal to buckle under the weight of the flight attendant's vitriol, was starting to unnerve the crowd. Brenda looked around, trying to gauge the mood of the passengers. The ones who had once nodded in agreement with her actions were now starting to shift in their seats, unease settling over them. One passenger, a young woman sitting near the front of the cabin, leaned over to her companion and whispered, "This is so wrong. What she's doing. This is not okay." As the tension built, the quiet became almost suffocating. Maya, still holding the pieces of her boarding pass, turned to the flight attendants with a look that was hard to decipher. It wasn't fear or anger. It was simply an unspoken message, one that said she wasn't finished yet. Brenda took a step forward, her voice trembling with a mix of frustration and false confidence.
"Get on your knees now!"
She spat, her finger pointing toward the floor. "Pick up your trash like you belong in economy class. Not here." But Maya, her voice unwavering, replied calmly, "I don't belong anywhere but where I choose to be." Brenda's face flushed with rage, but before she could respond, the cabin door opened with a loud click and the manager, Steve Morrison, appeared in the doorway. His presence was commanding, but even he seemed to hesitate when he saw the situation unfolding before him. The tension in the air was thick, and it felt as though everyone was holding their breath. As Steve Morrison stepped onto the plane, the tension in the cabin escalated. He had a reputation for handling difficult situations swiftly, but even he could sense the unease that hung in the air. The murmurs from the passengers had grown louder, and the expressions on their faces ranged from confusion to distaste. As the senior manager for this flight, Steve knew it was his job to maintain order and quickly. He glanced over at the flight attendants, his eyes narrowing when they failed to give him the full picture. Brenda, who had started this confrontation, looked almost desperate now, her posture defensive as she stood near Maya's seat. Brenda's hands were clenched at her sides, and she avoided making eye contact with the passengers, sensing their growing discomfort. Steve was a man used to the weight of authority, but even he had to admit that something was off about this scene. The passengers, normally so passive when it came to in-flight issues, were unusually vocal today. He could hear the quiet whispers from the back of the cabin, the sympathetic glances toward Maya, and the subtle shifts in the room. Brenda had crossed a line, and the flight's atmosphere had shifted from one of luxury to unease. "What's going on here?" Steve's voice cut through the tension like a knife, but his question wasn't directed at Maya. No, he was looking at Brenda, his tone laced with authority. "Attempted seat fraud, sir," Brenda replied without hesitation, though her voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. She quickly gestured toward Maya with a sharp motion. "She's been trying to sneak into first class with a fake boarding pass. She refuses to leave, and when I tried to question her, she became aggressive and combative." The look in Brenda's eyes, now filled with anxiety, made Steve pause. She wasn't the calm, collected flight attendant he was accustomed to. Something didn't feel right. Brenda's actions had caused a stir, but Steve had seen enough over the years to know how these situations usually played out. "Did you ask her for identification?" Steve asked, his gaze drifting briefly to Maya, who still stood there, seemingly unaffected by the chaos around her. "I did," Brenda snapped, the words coming out more defensively than she intended. But she refused to show it. "I'm sure this is just another scam." Steve looked at Maya then, really looked at her for the first time. Her simple attire, the worn jeans, the scuffed sneakers told a story of modest means, but there was an air of dignity about her that didn't match the image Brenda had painted. Steve's eyes narrowed, not out of suspicion but more out of curiosity. He had seen countless passengers, but this one was different. Still, his job was to handle the situation. He had a flight to manage. With a sigh, he turned to address Maya. "Mom, I'm going to need to see your boarding pass and ID, please." His tone was neutral but firm, as if this were simply protocol. Maya didn't flinch. Her face, still marked by the sting of the slap, was composed, and her voice was steady when she replied, "My boarding pass was destroyed. she said calmly. But I assure you, I am not the person you think I am. Brenda scoffed, clearly unimpressed. If you were who you claim to be, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, you'd have no problem showing us your ticket. A real first-class passenger would have no trouble proving their identity. Maya held her ground, not responding immediately. Her eyes briefly flickered to the passengers watching, the ones who had been silently observing the exchange. Her mind was working, calculating. This moment would not be wasted. She had something to prove, but it wasn't just to Brenda. It was to everyone who had ever been dismissed, underestimated, or mistreated. At that moment, another voice entered the scene, one that seemed to cut through the rising tension. It was Jessica Winters, a lifestyle influencer sitting in the first row. Jessica had been recording the entire encounter, her phone raised and capturing every second. "Oh my God, you guys," Jessica said into her phone, her voice laced with mock concern. "There's a scammer in first class right now trying to steal someone's seat. This flight attendant is handling it so well. She's really keeping this under control." Her stream, which had already been gaining traction, was now exploding in popularity. Comments flew by in real time, many of them supporting the flight attendant. "Good for her," one commenter wrote. "Finally, someone's standing up to these people." Another added, "Zero tolerance for this kind of behavior. It's about time someone did something." Brenda, now emboldened by the support she was receiving online, turned to face the passengers. "This is why we can't have nice things," she muttered, shaking her head. "People like this always think the rules don't apply to them." Maya, who'd been silently observing the unfolding drama, didn't flinch at the insults. Her mind was elsewhere, focused on the bigger picture. She knew the time would come soon when this would all turn around, when the truth would be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. But first, things had to play out. The commotion had drawn the attention of the airport's security team. Officer Derek Hayes, a tall, muscular man, appeared in the aisle, flanked by two other officers. Their presence added to the already intense atmosphere. "What's the situation here?" Officer Hayes asked, his voice calm but firm. "Seat fraud," Steve replied quickly, gesturing to Maya. "This woman has been causing a disturbance. She refuses to leave first class despite not having a legitimate ticket. She's already destroyed her boarding pass, and we need to remove her immediately." The officers turned their attention to Maya. Derek Hayes, though professional, couldn't hide the suspicion in his eyes. "Mom, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with us," he said, his hand resting near his sidearm, ready to act if things escalated further. Maya didn't move at first. She simply looked at the officers, then at the growing number of passengers who were still filming the situation. The weight of the crowd's judgment felt heavy, but Maya remained calm. "I understand," Maya said, her voice even and controlled. "But before I go, I think there's something you should know." Brenda sneered. "What could you possibly have to say at this point? You've already been caught." But Maya wasn't finished. She reached into her leather messenger bag, her movements slow and deliberate. The passengers watched intently, waiting for the next move. The officers tensed, their hands shifting to their belts. "Ma'am, keep your hands visible," Derek Hayes warned, his voice sharp now. Maya nodded, her expression unwavering. "I'm not reaching for anything dangerous," she assured them. "But you're about to learn something that will change everything." And then, slowly, Maya pulled out something unexpected, a sleek, official-looking badge. The metallic shine caught the light as she held it up for all to see. A murmur spread through the cabin. Brenda's sneer faltered. "Do you recognize this?" Maya asked, her voice steady, though there was a slight edge to it now. Officer Hayes stepped closer, his face furrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. "What is this?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Maya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she withdrew another document from her bag, this one a letter of appointment, embossed with the official American Airline seal. As she held it up, Maya's voice broke the silence. "I'm Maya Henderson, CEO of American Airlines." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The flight attendants, the security officers, and the passengers around them froze. The color drained from Brenda's face, and Steve Morrison's eyes widened as he took in the words on the page. Maya wasn't just any passenger. She was the head of the entire airline. Whoa, what? Brenda stammered, her voice cracking as she tried to regain control. I'm not done yet, Maya continued calmly, her eyes now fixed on the stunned flight attendants. I don't think you fully understand who you've just humiliated. As the passengers slowly began to realize what was unfolding, the murmurs grew louder. Maya wasn't just another passenger in the wrong seat. She was a force to be reckoned with. The woman who had been slapped, mocked, and disrespected was the very person responsible for this airline. The mood in the cabin was electric with tension, like a storm about to break. Brenda stood frozen, her face pale, mouth agape, as the words "I'm Maya Henderson, CEO of American Airlines" hung in the air like a declaration of war. She had slapped the CEO of the airline, a woman who, moments before, she had treated like a criminal. Now, the reality of her actions was crashing down on her, and there was no way out. The realization spread like wildfire throughout the first-class cabin. The murmurs among the passengers intensified, their disbelief giving way to curiosity, then to shock. A few passengers who had initially nodded along with Brenda's apparent righteousness now looked at the scene with unease. Some put their phones down, no longer recording, as if they had lost their appetite for the drama. They were now witnesses to something far bigger than they could have ever anticipated. Maya stood calm, holding up the laminated CEO badge and the official appointment letter, both gleaming under the overhead lights. The document seemed to shimmer with authority, but it was not the authenticity of the papers that was making everyone nervous. It was the fact that the woman they had all assumed to be a fraud was, in fact, the most powerful person in the room. Is this real? Brenda finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. She took an instinctive step back, her hands trembling at her sides. Maya didn't flinch. Her expression remained steely, unmoved by Brenda's dismay. It's as real as it gets, she said quietly, her words cutting through the tense silence that had descended on the cabin. Her calmness in the face of the overwhelming chaos only served to magnify the magnitude of the moment. Ma'am, you're not going to get away with this, Steve Morrison, the flight manager said shakily, but his words lacked conviction. He had been in this industry long enough to know when things were spiraling out of control, and this situation had gone far beyond anything he could have anticipated. The flight attendants, once confident in their positions, now looked like children caught in a lie. Maya's voice remained unshaken. I'm not trying to get away with anything, but I do believe you need to understand the gravity of what you've done. Brenda's face turned crimson, and her eyes darted around the cabin, looking for an escape from the situation she had single-handedly escalated. I didn't know, she whimpered. I didn't know who you were. You looked like a fraud? Maya cut her off, her voice laced with a quiet but unmistakable edge. You didn't know who I was, and yet you didn't hesitate to slap me, humiliate me, and call me a criminal in front of everyone here. She let the words hang in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. Maya turned toward the growing crowd of passengers, who were watching with bated breath. You see, the problem here isn't just that I was wrongfully accused. It's that I was judged based on how I look, based on assumptions about my race, my clothes, and my perceived status. And that, my friends, is exactly what's wrong with this world. Brenda swallowed hard, her throat tight. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her shame was evident, but it was more than just guilt, it was fear. She had acted out of prejudice, and now she was being exposed in front of a captive audience, not just in the cabin, but across the world. Maya's eyes never wavered. Do you think this is an isolated incident? That this is just about me? No. This is about a system that perpetuates discrimination every single day, in ways big and small, from the most overt racism to the subtle biases that cloud our judgment. The crowd fell silent, absorbing Maya's words. For the first time, Brenda seemed to understand the depth of her actions, and the weight of her guilt was nearly palpable. The slap, the mockery, the harsh treatment, it wasn't just an isolated incident of a flight attendant losing her temper. It was part of a much larger systemic issue, one that Maya was about to bring to the forefront. Before anyone could respond, Maya reached back into her leather bag, deliberately pulling out another document, this one thick and official-looking. The silence in the cabin deepened as she held it up for all to see.
And now here's something else you should know, Maya said calmly.
Her voice still unwavering. The document was a stock ownership certificate, official, legitimate, and irrefutable. She pointed to the bolded numbers at the top of the page. I don't just work for American Airlines. I own 12% of this company. That makes me the second largest shareholder. Brenda's eyes widened in horror as the truth sank in. You're the owner? She whispered, her voice hoarse, trembling with disbelief. Maya nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving Brenda's face. Yes. And I'm also the CEO. So when you decided to humiliate me today, when you decided that I didn't belong in first class because of the way I look, you didn't just assault a passenger. You assaulted the CEO of the airline you work for. The room was still. The words seemed to echo off the walls, and for the first time, the passengers who'd been recording the situation seemed to understand the full weight of what they had just witnessed. The woman they had assumed to be a fraud was not only the highest-ranking individual in the airline, she was a living, breathing example of how systemic discrimination could be exposed and dismantled. Brenda took a step back, her face flushed with embarrassment. She had assumed that Maya was a fraud because of her appearance, her simple clothing, her demeanor, everything that didn't fit the stereotype of a first-class passenger. And now, that assumption had come crashing down in front of her. Maya didn't show anger. She showed understanding. She didn't yell or demand retribution. Instead, she spoke with calm authority, her voice firm but not harsh. Brenda, you have to understand something. What you did today isn't just about you and me. It's about a culture that allows this to happen, a culture that lets people be judged based on their appearance and not their character or their worth. You've exposed not only your own biases, but the very flaws in this system. And that, unfortunately, is something that needs to be addressed on a much larger scale. Maya's words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. She wasn't just exposing Brenda's prejudice. She was holding up a mirror to everyone in the room. The passengers who had once supported Brenda's actions were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Maya had turned the situation on its head. She had made them all look at themselves and reconsider what they had been complicit in. Brenda's lips trembled, and she opened her mouth, her eyes darting around the cabin as if searching for a way out. I'm sorry, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't mean to. I know you didn't, Maya interrupted, her voice softer now, but no less firm. But that doesn't change the fact that you need to understand the consequences of your actions. I'm not going to make this easy for you. You're going to have to reckon with this. Before Brenda could speak again, Maya turned her attention to the officers. You see, I've been flying under the radar for years now, quietly observing the system, noting every flaw, every instance of mistreatment. Today, you all have become a part of the very thing I've been fighting to change. But the truth will come to light. And it starts here. Right now. Maya's gaze shifted to the other passengers, who were now completely engrossed in the unfolding drama. She could see the realization dawning on their faces, the change in their expressions from judgment to curiosity, from anger to empathy. She wasn't just exposing Brenda's racism. She was laying the groundwork for something much larger, something more transformative than anyone in that cabin could have imagined. The realization settled in, and with it, the shift of power. Maya Henderson, the woman who had been slapped, humiliated, and disrespected, was now in control. And she wasn't finished yet. The shock of Maya's revelation hung heavily in the air, like a thick fog that no one could escape. For a few moments, no one spoke. The passengers who had been recording the entire incident now lowered their phones, seemingly unsure of what to do next. The flight attendants, their confidence shattered, stood frozen in place. Steve Morrison, the flight manager, seemed to shrink under the weight of what had just been uncovered. Brenda Collins, the woman who had started this whole ordeal, was visibly trembling, her face pale as she tried to comprehend the magnitude of her mistake. But Maya was not done. She stood tall in the center of the cabin, a calm and unwavering presence amidst the chaos. Her voice broke the silence. I didn't come here to make a scene, she said, her tone still steady but filled with a quiet authority that seemed to command respect. But I will make sure that this doesn't go unnoticed. Brenda's eyes were wide with fear, and and she took an involuntary step back. I didn't know, she stammered. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just another fraud. Maya's gaze was unyielding, her words cutting through Brenda's apology. It doesn't matter who I am, she said firmly. It matters how you treated me. It matters how you assume my worth based on what you saw on the outside. And it matters that, despite my position and my authority, you felt it was acceptable to slap me, humiliate me, and call me a criminal in front of everyone here. The weight of those words seemed to hit Brenda like a physical blow. She opened her mouth to speak again, but no words came out. Her hands trembled as she wiped the tears from her cheeks, but they were tears not of remorse, they were the tears of someone who had realized too late that her actions had crossed a line she could never uncross. Maya's voice remained calm but unwavering. You may not have known who I was, but that doesn't excuse what you did. You didn't stop to think before you acted. You didn't ask questions. You made assumptions about me based on the way I looked, based on the way I dressed. And now, because of that, you will face the consequences. The cabin was eerily quiet. The weight of Maya's words, the rawness of her pain, had left everyone in stunned silence. Maya turned toward the other passengers, her eyes scanning the cabin as she addressed them, her voice now carrying a sense of power that hadn't been there before. And to everyone else who has been silently watching, don't think this is just about me. Don't think that what happened here today isn't a reflection of a larger problem. It's about how we treat each other, how we judge each other, how we assume that someone who doesn't fit our idea of respectability doesn't deserve the same treatment as those who do. The words echoed through the cabin, leaving a trail of discomfort in their wake. The passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unsure of how to react. They had witnessed the brutal confrontation between Maya and Brenda, but now, with the weight of Maya's revelation, they were beginning to understand the depth of the issue at hand. Maya turned her attention back to Steve Morrison. I've been watching this airline for years now, she said, her voice unwavering. I've seen how passengers are treated based on how they look, what they wear, what they sound like. I've seen the biases in the way employees interact with people, and I've seen how those biases affect the experience of passengers who don't fit the mold of the ideal customer. Steve's face drained of color as he processed her words. Maya was not just a CEO. She was an observer, a silent witness to the systemic failures within her own company. You've been conducting audits? He asked in a low voice, almost as if he were afraid to hear the answer. Maya nodded. Yes. I've been flying on this airline, on other airlines, anonymously conducting audits to see how employees treat passengers when they think no one is watching. What I've seen time and time again is that the people who look like me or who don't fit the proper mold are treated differently. We're assumed to be less than. We're judged before we even speak. The room fell silent again, the passengers now fully aware that they were witnessing something far more significant than just a confrontation between an employee and a customer. They were witnessing the beginning of something that could change the entire industry. Maya's gaze shifted back to Brenda, her expression unchanged. You will face the consequences of your actions, Brenda. This is not just about an apology. This is about accountability. I will make sure that this is investigated fully, that it is documented, and that the proper actions are taken. Brenda's knees seemed to give way beneath her. She stumbled slightly, her face streaked with tears. Please, Miss Henderson, she begged, her voice broken. I didn't mean to. I was just doing my job. I thought I was helping. Maya's voice softened, but her resolve was clear. No, Brenda. You weren't helping. You were perpetuating the very system that needs to change. And now, it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. The tension in the cabin remained thick, but the passengers were starting to understand that this moment wasn't just about a flight attendant losing her job. It was about a much larger conversation, one that Maya was about to lead. She turned her attention to Officer Derek Hayes, who had been quietly observing the exchange. Officer, she said, her tone calm but firm, I need you to begin an investigation into this incident. I'm filing a formal complaint against this flight attendant for physical assault, racial profiling, and discriminatory behavior. This will be taken to the highest levels of the company, and it will not be swept under the rug. The officer, who'd been silent until now, nodded slowly. "Understood, ma'am," he said, his voice professional but with an undertone of respect. Maya looked back at Steve Morrison. "And you," she said, her voice steady as the manager in charge, "you will be required to assist in this investigation. Your failure to address this sooner is unacceptable." Steve's face flushed with a mixture of shame and fear. He nodded quickly, realizing the full scope of the situation. "I'm not just going to stop here," Maya continued, her gaze scanning the cabin. "I will make sure that these policies are reviewed and changed across this entire airline. Discrimination, bias, and unequal treatment have no place in our company. It's time to implement real change." The room was still, but there was a sense of anticipation now. The passengers, who had watched in silence as this drama unfolded, were beginning to understand that something was shifting, something important. The woman they had underestimated was not only powerful, she was using that power for something bigger than herself. And Brenda, who had once stood as a symbol of authority, now stood as a reminder of the very things that Maya was determined to change. The shift in power was complete. Maya stood resolutely in the midst of the stunned silence that engulfed the cabin. The magnitude of the situation had hit every corner of the aircraft, from the first-class passengers to the flight attendants, and even the crew members in the back. What had started as an unfortunate and seemingly isolated incident had quickly transformed into something far greater and awakening, not just for Brenda, but for everyone present. Maya had exposed the systemic rot that ran deep within the airline industry, and now it was clear that this moment would be the spark for change. Brenda, still shaking and pale, had no words left. The terror she felt was written all over her face. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the magnitude of her error, but the reality was inescapable. Maya Henderson was not a person to be trifled with. The CEO, a woman she had judged based on her appearance, was now holding the power to shape her future, and Brenda knew her actions had consequences. Maya's unwavering stance was not just a declaration of personal authority, but a beacon of strength for everyone watching. She was not angry. She was resolute. She was not seeking retribution. She was seeking transformation. The murmurs from the passengers started again, this time more tentative, more respectful. They had witnessed the power dynamics shift, and they were beginning to see the layers of injustice unfold. What had been a spectacle of humiliation was now being viewed as an opportunity for change, for real accountability. Maya turned her attention back to Steve Morrison, the flight manager, who was visibly struggling to come to terms with the enormity of what was unfolding. His eyes darted nervously, glancing between Brenda and Maya, as though he were searching for a way out. "I understand this is a lot to process," Maya said, her voice calm, measured, yet firm. "But there is no room for ambiguity here. You will all understand that what just happened is not just a personal issue between me and Brenda. It is indicative of a larger problem that exists within this company and within the airline industry as a whole. And we are going to address it now." Steve swallowed, his throat tight with the weight of her words. I understand, Miss Henderson," he muttered, his voice shaking. "No," Maya corrected him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I understand you understand, Steve. But what I need from you right now is action. I need you to help ensure that this does not happen again, and that the people who are responsible face the consequences." Steve's face flushed as he struggled to form a coherent response. "Of course," he said finally, his words clipped. "We'll begin an investigation. We'll take immediate action. You have my word." "Good," Maya replied, her gaze never leaving his face. "You can start by supporting the investigation into Brenda's actions. But understand this, Steve, this cannot be swept under the rug. If you do not act swiftly and transparently, you will be complicit in the very discrimination I am trying to eliminate from this company." The seriousness in Maya's voice left no room for doubt. Steve nodded again, but the lack of confidence in his eyes was palpable. He knew this was a turning point, not just for Brenda, but for him and for the company as a whole. Maya turned back to face the passengers, her gaze sweeping across the cabin as she addressed them directly. What happened here today is a small example of something much larger. A system that operates on assumptions, on stereotypes, on the belief that people should be treated differently based on their race, their class, or their appearance. This incident was about me, yes. But it's not just about me. This is about every single person who has been marginalized or mistreated because they didn't meet the so-called standards set by others. Her words resonated deeply with the passengers. What had once seemed like a simple conflict between a flight attendant and a passenger was now understood as a much larger issue, a reflection of the biases and prejudices that lurk just beneath the surface of everyday interactions. Maya continued, her voice unwavering and powerful. I've been quietly working behind the scenes to address these issues within American Airlines. Today, this incident exposed just how deep the problem goes. But this is not just about correcting this one wrong. This is about changing the culture of this company and ensuring that discrimination is not tolerated, whether it's blatant or subtle. The passengers listened intently, many of them now fully aware of the significance of what was unfolding. Maya's message was clear. This wasn't just an isolated incident of prejudice. It was a reflection of a much larger entrenched system of inequality, one that she was now determined to dismantle. Discrimination doesn't just happen in the overt moments, Maya continued. It's built into the fabric of how we treat people, how we assume worth based on appearance, how we judge someone's ability to belong or succeed based on how they look or where they come from. We need to be better. We need to demand better from ourselves and from each other. And that starts with accountability. Maya paused for a moment, allowing her words to settle in. She knew she wasn't just talking to the passengers in the cabin. She was speaking to a much larger audience. The cameras had already started rolling again, recording every word, every shift in power, every moment of transformation. I've been flying on this airline for years now, observing how things work, quietly gathering information and taking notes, Maya added. But I'm done being quiet. And I'm done allowing this company or any other company to perpetuate these discriminatory practices. The truth is that we, as a company, have been failing. And I'm not going to let that continue. Her declaration of action sent ripples through the cabin. For the first time, Maya's power wasn't just rooted in her position. It was in her ability to call out the truth and demand that it be acknowledged. The passengers could feel it. Something real was happening here. This was no longer just a confrontation between an upset passenger and an overzealous flight attendant. This was a moment of awakening, a challenge to the status quo. I will personally oversee an investigation into this incident, and I will ensure that it is thorough and transparent, Maya continued. But beyond that, I'm going to implement new policies within American Airlines. We are going to provide anti-bias and sensitivity training to every employee. We are going to create an environment where all passengers, regardless of their background, are treated with the same respect and dignity. And we are going to do this across the entire airline industry. Maya's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her words carrying the weight of not just her own experiences, but the experiences of countless others who'd been mistreated or overlooked. She wasn't just holding Brenda accountable, she was holding the entire industry accountable. The time for change is now, Maya concluded, her eyes scanning the cabin one last time. And I'm not just going to be a part of the change, I'm going to lead it. The silence that followed was profound. The passengers sat in stunned awe, many of them now recognizing the true significance of what had just transpired. What they had witnessed wasn't just a dramatic reversal of fortunes, it was the beginning of a shift in how people would be treated, how biases would be challenged, and how accountability would no longer be optional. Maya turned back to Brenda, who was now standing in front of her, her body trembling. You will be removed from your position, Brenda, Maya said, her voice calm but firm. You are suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Your actions have cost this airline more than you realize. Brenda's face crumpled in despair, but Maya wasn't finished. But this is not just about punishment. This is about growth. You will undergo a complete sensitivity and anti-bias training program, and you will be required to work with civil rights organizations to understand the full scope of your actions. Your job is not just to serve passengers. It's to treat every single person with the dignity and respect they deserve. The truth was undeniable now. Brenda's career had been shattered, but Maya had no intention of letting this moment pass without ensuring that something meaningful came from it. Maya's gaze turned to Steve, her expression unwavering. "And you, Steve, will work with me to ensure that these new policies are implemented across." Steve, his face still pale, nodded silently, understanding that this was no longer a simple issue to be swept under the rug. This was a company-wide reckoning. The entire airline. This is not negotiable. Steve, his face still pale, nodded silently, understanding that this was no longer a simple issue to be swept under the rug. This was a company-wide reckoning. As Maya turned to leave, the passengers began to stir, murmurs of approval and disbelief filling the cabin. The wheels of change had started turning, and no one, not Brenda, not Steve, not anyone, could stop it now. The flight had taken on an entirely new atmosphere by the time Maya made her way to her seat. The unease from earlier had transformed into a sense of tense anticipation. The passengers who had been recording, the flight attendants who had been complicit, and the managers who had been caught off guard were all left to reflect on what had just happened. But for Maya, the journey was far from over. The events of the past hour had been a mere opening act in a much larger story. As she settled back into her seat, Maya turned her attention to the now quiet first-class cabin. Her role was no longer just to assert her authority. She had set the wheels in motion for something much larger. This moment, this exposure of the culture of prejudice that had run rampant under the surface of the airline industry, was only the beginning of the change she was going to bring about. She knew that Brenda's actions were only a small example of what was wrong in the company. What had happened to her was not a one-off incident. It was part of a much deeper issue, one that Maya had long been aware of and had quietly studied for years. Now that issue had been exposed to the world, and the moment of reckoning was just beginning. Maya had already begun to put plans in motion for systemic change, but she knew that the process would not be easy. There would be pushback, there would be resistance, but it had to be done. And as the CEO of American Airlines, it was her responsibility to lead the charge. The moment Maya had revealed her position as CEO had left the entire first-class cabin in stunned silence. As the reality of the situation settled in, the passengers who had earlier been quick to judge Maya began to understand the magnitude of what had transpired. Brenda had not only been wrong, she had treated Maya, the very leader of the airline, as if she were a criminal, simply because she didn't fit the stereotype of a first-class passenger. Maya turned her attention to the captain, who had been quietly observing the exchange from the front of the cabin. Captain Robert Kane had long held a distinguished career, his silver hair and decorated uniform exuding authority and respect. But now, he seemed unsure of his footing, his face pale, his hands twitching with nervous energy. The once confident captain had been reduced to a man standing on the precipice of a corporate disaster. "Captain," Maya said, her voice firm, "I understand that your priority is the safety of the passengers. But today your actions, or lack thereof, contributed to the injustice that has been done here. I expect a full review of the flight crew's actions and a transparent investigation into this incident." Captain Kane opened his mouth to protest, but Maya's unwavering gaze shut him down before he could speak. "Do you have anything to add, Captain?" she asked, her tone cutting through the tension like a razor. I didn't know," he muttered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know who she was." His voice trailed off as Maya stood up, gathering the full attention of the cabin. The once proud captain was no longer in control of the narrative. Maya exhaled slowly, taking a step closer. "That's the problem, Captain. No one bothered to ask questions. Everyone assumed. And that's why we are here today." As she turned back toward the front of the cabin, Maya's eyes briefly scanned the faces of the passengers. She had gained their respect, but she knew the fight was far from over. This wasn't just about Brenda, or Captain Kane, or even American Airlines. It was about a shift in the very foundation of how people in power treat those who are marginalized, misunderstood, or discriminated against. Maya understood that while the incident had started with her, it now represented something far greater. Turning back to the rest of the crew, Maya continued, "I want an immediate audit of this flight and the crew's performance. I want to see the records of how many complaints were filed against this flight and its staff. If any of the passengers here were mistreated, I expect an apology, and I expect it to be genuine." Steve Morrison, now standing at the back of the cabin, nodded quickly. His eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. Maya wasn't just wielding power, she was using it to hold the airline accountable for the failing. That had existed for far too long. The flight attendants who had earlier looked upon Maya with disdain now stood with their heads down, ashamed. They were no longer in control of the situation. Their power had been shattered, and in its place, Maya had woven a new narrative, one where fairness and dignity were no longer optional. Maya's calm, authoritative voice broke the silence. I will not tolerate any form of racial profiling, bias, or discrimination. The truth is that these issues exist everywhere, not just here, not just in airlines. But today, I am starting with American Airlines. I am making it clear that no one will be treated differently based on how they look, where they come from, or what they wear. Not on my watch. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Maya wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, every person who had been judged before they were given a chance. She was fighting for those who didn't have the power to change the system. Turning to the flight attendants, she added, "You have a responsibility. You are here to serve, yes, but you are also here to represent the values of this company. And today, those values were not upheld. I expect each and every one of you to reflect on your behavior. You will undergo sensitivity training, just as the management and corporate staff will. We will all be held accountable." Maya's words hung in the air, and for the first time, the flight attendants seemed to understand the weight of their role. They were no longer just employees on a plane. They were part of something larger, a movement that would change the face of the airline industry. And they were going to have to answer for their actions. The room remained quiet for a few moments, the tension finally beginning to ease. But Maya wasn't done. She had more to say, and she wasn't going to leave until her point had been made loud and clear. Taking a deep breath, she turned back to the passengers. "To everyone on this flight," she said, her voice firm but empathetic, "I apologize for the disruption. I know this was uncomfortable for all of you, but sometimes change comes with discomfort. And it is necessary if we want a future where everyone is treated with respect, no matter who they are. I appreciate your patience today, and I promise you that this will never happen again." With those final words, Maya sat back down in her seat, her posture relaxed but authoritative. The flight attendants exchanged looks, their previous arrogance replaced with a mixture of fear and recognition. They had just witnessed a shift in power, and Maya had been the force behind it. As the flight continued its journey to its destination, the passengers slowly resumed their conversations, but the energy in the cabin had changed. The tension had lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of hope. They had witnessed something rare, and injustice had been exposed, and the person who'd been wronged had turned it into an opportunity for real change. The fight was far from over, but Maya had shown them one thing: justice, though often delayed, was inevitable when the right person was in the room. As the plane continued its course, Maya looked out the window, lost in thought. The road ahead would be long, but she was prepared for it. The changes she had set in motion were only the beginning. And as she thought about the future, she knew that her work had just begun, not only for herself, but for everyone who had been marginalized or treated unfairly. This was a new beginning,